everyone. This is one of our favorite things that we do here as an equity department and in partnership with our student services division as well. My name is Fabiola Bagula, she, her, hers. And again, on behalf of San Diego County Office of Education, we welcome you, and we're very grateful that you're spending your afternoon here with us. As listeners, and I know that we're here to listen to our students, we always ask that we take a listening stance that's very open heart, open mind, and open will. And then, of course, leaning into Silko, who is an American Indian scholar who states that our stories are not for our entertainment, but they are for our learning. And so I know that all of us that are here to bear witness and to listen to children's stories, that we're actually going to be impact change back at our schools as a result of what we hear today. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to preface by saying that the slides that were created today were a request of the student panelists. We talked to them about what would be a good data set to have us go through, and so this was their suggestion. So I love that they have this level of autonomy and voice, and it's of course our pleasure to amplify it. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go over some brief data. But of course, the majority of our time will be listening to our students. And then in the end, what they also suggested is they made a list of resources for all of our school systems. So again, when I think about amplifying student voice and agency and leadership, the children you're about to listen to are complete. We should just hire them to run this department, quite frankly. They're going to be beautiful. So this is some data from across our county. And what I just want you to take a look at is the number of students that we have here in San Diego County, the number of students who, according to this California Healthy Kids Survey, identified male, identified female, and identified non-binary. And I know the question that is on the slide is, what do you notice? What are you curious about? But I just want you to pay attention to that data set. Now moving forward to another piece of data is, again, what do you notice and what are you curious about? Now, as we know, the California Healthy Kids Survey is done with not all grades, but some grades. And so we have some data on self-reported sexual orientation for grades 7, 9, and 11. And so again, as you look at these numbers, as you look at self-reported sexual orientation, what do you notice and what are you curious about? And these are the questions we should have, because we should be very mindful that the children before us are sitting in our school systems. And I know I always strive to do the best, but I also know that I might have made some mistakes that I want to correct. And so this session is again for us to get closer to understanding, to get past allyship and be more of an accomplice on behalf of our LGBTQIA+ youth and community. So I'm now going to pass it along to Ms. Singleton, I'm proud to be your colleague in front.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Fabi. I too am proud to work alongside you and very proud to be here today as I am, in the spirit of transparency, learning to be a better accomplice. As Dr. Fabi said, these young people have taught us so much as we prepare for this workshop. So I want to point that out because I want to make it clear that you never reach a point of completion. This is a journey that we're all on as we're learning together. And when we know better, we can do better. So keeping on with this same critical self-reflection, taking a look at suicide ideation. And if you look at the date, 2017 through 2019, this was even before the COVID-19 pandemic. But when you look at this data, think about your own context. Think about your own position of privilege in your role as an educator and the opportunities that you have to support young people who may be in your system, struggling with all of the challenges that come with identifying something that is outside of the norm in our society. And here's school connectedness. So this is a buzzword, student engagement and feeling welcome and belonging. But again, when you look at this specific demographic group, let's look at how disconnected they feel in school. And again, doing your own critical self-reflection. What do you notice? What are you curious about? But how can you leverage the power in your context to disrupt this? And our next slide, LGBTQ youth are 120% more likely to experience homelessness. You can read this, but I want to say it again. LGBTQ youth are 120% more likely to experience homelessness, and this can be for various reasons. So think about, again, how we're supporting our youth so they feel safe to come to us and tell us what challenges they are having. It may be at home because they're not out, or because they've come out and they're not welcome in their home, they are pushed out on the streets. So how can we leverage our positions of power and privilege in our systems to give these youth the support that they need to ensure that they're taken care of? And here are just some qualitative snippets on how our young people feel when they're in our school systems, and we ignore their identities. We ignore their chosen name, right? We're totally ignoring who they show up as and who they are as a person, and we are in many ways erasing who they are. So these are actual quotes from our young people, and I'll just give you a couple seconds to read them. And if you notice, it's basic needs like using the restroom or being in a health class that doesn't acknowledge their gender identity or sexual orientation. And our next couple of slides really lean into the theory of intersectionality. And intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a civil rights attorney and professor. And really, in talking about intersectionality, we often talk about it as our gender and our race and how they intersect. But in reality, because we live in a society that tends to discriminate and push folks who are different to the margins, think of intersectionality as layers of overlapping weights that you're putting on. When you talk about race, when you talk about your identity, when you talk about your sexual orientation or your gender, you know, those are different weights because you're treated certain ways with all of those identities. And then you layer that on with the experiences of racism. So you feel already ostracized and pushed to the margins as someone that's identifying as LGBTQ. And then when you add the layer of race on there, there is another layer of discrimination. So again, these are just some data sets that we want you to not only view, but think about how you can consume them and then apply them to your context. And lastly, we're looking at the bullying data. So again, the courage that these youth have to show up and be their authentic selves, it costs them a lot of ways. And this bullying data is alarming because this type of behavior often leads to that suicidal ideation or suicide completion. So we're hoping that today you will hear their stories. We also want to say that these stories are the stories of these young people, but there are youth who chose not to come forward today because of fear of being outed, fear of retaliation and repercussions. But again, we thank you today for just taking this step with us as we learn more from our student voices.
And so again, I love that our students gave us the suggestions as to which data points to present. And I also want to thank the Equity Department, Ebony Weathers, that helped us create those slide decks that will be made available to you. But without further ado, and what we would like to, of course, give the most of our time is to our students. And so I want to introduce to you both Evan and Camille, who will be our Emcees. And honestly, I can just be quiet now because they're so good. So Evan and Camille, it's all you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. To start our panel off, we're going to go around and share our names, how we identify, and a bit about who we'd like to honor for being here today. So I'll start us off. My name is Camille. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a queer person. And today I'd like to dedicate this conversation to all of the queer and trans youth who are being targeted by discriminatory legislation that's occurring in our country today. All youth deserve to feel loved, safe, and seen. So next, Chelsea, would you like to start introducing yourself?
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, I'm Chelsea. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm dedicating this conversation to queer activists in the past who've made it possible for us to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here, Chelsea. Gray, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Gray. I identify as a trans masculine Latino person, and I'm dedicating this conversation to everybody who's here to work on their allyship journey and to struggling trans youth, especially because of the legislation that's happening right now.
Thank you for being here today, Gray. Annalie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, I'm Annalie. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as a queer Asian, and I'm dedicating this conversation to my grandmother because she's always believed and supported me.
Thank you so much for being here, Annalie. Shiloh, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Shiloh. I use they and them. I identify as queer, and I am dedicating this conversation to my mentor and queer role model, Jen, because they have supported me throughout my queer experience.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here, Shiloh. And Jax, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name's Jax and I use he, they pronouns. I identify as transmasculine, gender nonconforming, bisexual, and someone on the ACE spectrum. And I am dedicating this conversation to all queer students who are not yet out at school or at home or do not have support in these environments, because y'all need the most support from us with more privilege.
Thank you so much, Jax. Thank you for being here. And Evan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Camille. My name is Evan. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I identify as a agender, asexual person of Romani descent. I'm dedicating this conversation to my twin sister because without her bravery, I wouldn't be here on my journey. So we're going to go ahead, and our first kind of official question is going to be, what has been your experience with assumptions that are made for your being LGBTQ? So speaking from my own experience, I'll say that while I was in high school, I was very vocal about my identity, both my gender and my sexual orientation. And so a lot of folks, including my teachers, made some assumptions that I was an expert about the LGBTQ community at that age. I wasn't out at home. I didn't know a whole lot about advocacy or my own rights. And so a lot of times I was stuck in awkward or uncomfortable positions because I would be asked questions that I didn't necessarily know the answer to. So that was an assumption that folks made about me and my own experience. I'm going to open it up now to our panelists, starting with Chelsea.
Okay, so I've experienced not so much assumptions about being queer, but assumptions about not being queer. And in school particularly, teachers often default to cis and straight unless students indicate otherwise. Like, for example, say a guy gets a text in class and the teacher will jokingly say, "Oh, is it your girlfriend? Haha." Or the teacher will see a feminine student in a skirt and be like, "Oh, that's a girl," and use she, her. And this might seem like not that harmful, but this idea of cishet as the default can be really problematic and causes a lot of strife for queer people, particularly queer people who aren't out yet. And it would really be better if we could just limit these assumptions in any way possible.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. That's a really significant point, and I'm really glad you made that. Gray, would you like to answer next?
Yeah, so personally, I've always been very masculine. As a child, I was assigned female at birth, but when I was 3 years old, my parents would put me in dresses and I would like kick and scream and cry because I was like, I just don't like them. You know, I didn't like the color pink and I was just pretty traditionally masculine. And so in a lot of ways, I got asked a lot when I was younger, like, are you a boy or a girl? Are you, insert slurs? Are you trans? All these sorts of things. People would sort of like pick and prod at my identity to like a very young child. So in a lot of ways, I would revert back to being like, oh yeah, of course I'm a girl, because of course I wouldn't think anything else. And so I think that having the look of someone who's queer has made people pick at my identity and make them feel like they deserve something from me, like some sort of answer about who I am or what I am. And yeah, that was one of the things in my childhood that was really, that really affected me. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that with us. I appreciate it. Annalie, would you like to share next?
Yes. I've also had problems with people assuming my sexual orientation and my gender by what I wear and my hairstyle. Because last year when I had shorter hair, people thought it was a boy at first. And then they thought it was gay, which was hurtful. And then it also took me a long time for me to come out. And then just a lot of difficulties with finally being able to wear what I want to wear.
Thank you so much. Both you and Gray bring up those assumptions that are made based on our physical appearance. I think that's really significant that we be mindful of when going into these conversations. Shiloh?
Yeah, the one that I experience most, like at school, especially, is that people assume that because I am pretty visibly queer and I'm, president of my GSA, that like LGBT issues are all I'm going to talk about. And it's often not what I'm talking about at school. I'm asking if we had math homework not last night, not if if we're interested in dismantling the gender, it just isn't what I'm talking about at school. And another assumption that I find, kind of what Evan was mentioning earlier, is that people assuming I can explain or justify my identities, and especially that once I've come out, that's it. Of okay, I did it once, I got it right the first time, and it's never going to change. It's I'm 17, everything, my whole personality changes every 2 weeks. So I need it's a constant experience of constantly learning more about myself and coming out and asking people to maybe refer to me in one way or another. So that's my experience.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Shiloh. I think that piece of, you all are still exploring your identities and learning about yourselves in tandem with homework and social pressure. And so that's a really potent piece to this conversation as well. Thank you. And Jax?
My experiences as a queer person have been rather fortunate. I've faced little discrimination for how I identify, and I intentionally surround myself with other queer people because I know it's more likely for me to be treated the way that I want to be around people who are like me. So I haven't heard nor experienced any assumptions around my queerness.
Thank you for being honest about that. I think sometimes we get very caught up in the visibility aspect and the harm that's done to us as queer youth, that it's also important to remember that you all are strong and resilient and are able to surround yourselves with positive people as well. Camille, I would also love to hear from you about your own experiences with assumptions.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you for everyone for sharing. Those are some incredible points. For myself personally, I've heard a lot of assumptions about queer and trans identities being something that youth especially latch onto because they are trendy, or maybe adults who aren't understanding of these identities are seeing them more in the news and the media, and so they're thinking that youth who have these identities are just following trends, when that's an extremely harmful assumption to hold and to spread, because youth are incredibly capable of knowing themselves and exploring their identities. And we should be validating those experiences of identity exploration and formation, because it's a beautiful thing to know yourself. So we'll move on to our next question. For our third question, what is your experience with being harmed by discrimination at school for being LGBTQ? I'll share for myself personally. I went to a fairly liberal high school, and despite this, I experienced quite a bit of hostility around my queer identity. Even before I came out, I was hearing a lot of anti-gay, anti-trans slurs pretty much on a daily basis. People would make really hateful jokes. And while a lot of teachers were supportive of queer and trans identities, there were teachers who would hear those jokes and say, well, they're just joking, or that's just their opinion. And it, it felt really normalized to hear those kinds of things at school. So we'd love to hear from the rest of our panelists. Chelsea, can you start us off?
Yeah, I'm basically just going to agree with you. In school, it's not really about what teachers say, it's about what they don't say. They ignore stuff. They ignore gay as a slur, they ignore misgendering and dead naming. They don't speak up, and this creates a really negative environment for queer students in general. And it can be really upsetting and honestly even scary to hear these teachers not speak up for you and just let these hurtful things pass by.
Thank you for sharing, Chelsea. You bring up a great point that that absence of action can be just as harmful for us as the action itself. And not having that support can be really hurtful as a student. So Gray, would you like to share next?
Yeah, I really love what Chelsea was saying about how a lot of teachers do tend to sweep things under the rug because it opens up a broader conversation about diversity and the respective pronouns and gender identity, which a lot of people don't want to have. And personally, with my experiences, I'm kind of in a unique situation right now. I sort of came into my identity as a trans person while I was going to a single sex only school. So in a lot of ways, it feels a little bit more archaic there since it is a bit of like a traditional, more conservative administration. In a lot of ways, I feel both like ostracized and sort of people are confused by me being there, and then also like fetishized and objectified almost. Like a lot of people talk about me like I'm some, like they're doing such good charity work because they're being friends with me, the little gay kid. Like they talk a lot too about like it's some sort of accomplishment to be friends with me because I guess they're just being like so tolerant, yet they still don't respect my pronouns, which is one of the biggest things there, is that my pronouns and my identity isn't respected. I've gotten a lot of people like, so why would you go here if you don't identify, as a girl? And I was like, well, not everybody has the option to move schools. Not everybody has the means to come out to their family. And me personally, I didn't realize before I came here due to a lot of internalized transphobia. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Gray. You bring up an excellent point that teachers often shy away from topics that they feel uncomfortable or unknowledgeable about. And that should be an indicator that, to educate yourself and help support those students with your new knowledge. So thank you. Annalie, can you share next?
I 100% agree with everything that you guys have been saying about how teachers do not acknowledge the harassment going on, just as the derogatory language. And there's a lot of ignorance towards not knowing the difference between gender and sexual identity. In one of my classes, some people were talking about how they didn't understand why someone would change their gender, but still date someone of the opposite sex, and why they shouldn't just stay the gender that they were given at birth.
Thank you for sharing, Annalie. I think that's a really common misconception that you bring up, that gender and sexual identity are one and the same when they're two very different things that we experience, both on a spectrum of their own. So Shiloh, can you go ahead and share?
Absolutely. I know one of the main experiences that I've had is a lot of offhand comments, not in the classrooms, but like in the hallways or during lunch, of like kind of what's been mentioned of like, that's so gay, or that's really fruity. For some reason, fruity is one that's common at my school. And it's never been directed at me. And it's never even been too particularly hateful, but it sticks with me. I remember it walking down the halls. I'm like, that's where that person was, and that's where that person was, or that's what class I was walking to. Like, it just really does stick with you. And another one is like, especially when it comes to changing your names and asking people to use different pronouns, seeing the experiences of others in my school who have changed their name and pronouns, or even come into the school with a name that's not like the legal one, and with like they and them pronouns, and people at my school just pretty much like ignoring it and not using the pronouns that the students have asked for, and not using that new name, makes me like uncomfortable coming out at school, because like they're just going to ignore what I want, even though like all my teachers, they like me and they're all super nice, but they just won't take that extra step, which has always made me a little bit uncomfortable.
Thank you so much for sharing, Shiloh. You talked about how even when we experience or when we witness discrimination happening to other people, it still affects us and makes us feel less safe in our environment. So thank you for bringing that up. Jax, can you go ahead and share?
Yeah, when I first came out as trans and at the time non-binary, I didn't face much backlash, but there was a student whom I had never spoken to before who was outraged by my name and pronoun change. He went out of his way on a daily to misgender me and address me incorrectly when he'd never had to address me in the past, and there was no reason to address me then. And thankfully, the staff at my school are super supportive. So I spoke to GSA advisors and school counselors, and eventually my situation was resolved. This was the most extreme case that I can think of, but when at the beginning of my 7th grade year and probably throughout the first half of that year, I was questioning my gender identity. I wasn't fully sure how I identified. I was pretty sure I was non-binary, but I just wasn't sure. So there's a lot of experimenting and confusion on my end and probably on other people's ends as well. And at the beginning of the school year, I started very typical, going by the initial of my dead name and using they, them pronouns. And I hadn't really publicly announced, I am trans, I use they, them, I hadn't announced it to the world, but it was something that whenever someone would use she, her with me, I would say, hey, actually, I use they, them. And nobody caught on that my initial was a name change instead of a nickname. Nobody caught on that there was they, them going on. And I was just, my dead name and she, her for a while. And fortunately, I am capable of really putting my foot down, setting boundaries, being clear with people, but some people are not super capable of that. And I had to have courage to really put my foot down and say, this is my name, these are my pronouns, nothing else, this is how I have to be referred to. And like Shiloh mentioned, I've had so many questions around things that I didn't know, because I'm especially at the time was not a genius on the community. I was so confused myself. I've been asked how many genders there are. It's like, what? Yeah. So it's definitely there's been a lot of interesting experiences on my end as well.
Thank you for sharing that experience, Jax. I'm sorry that you experienced that hostility, but I'm so glad that you had those self-advocacy skills to put in place and stick up for yourself. And it just shows how important it is that the adults around us also advocate for our safety. So Evan, would you like to close out that question for us?
Of course, thank you so much. Like what a lot of our youth said, that piece of inaction from the adults in a space can be hugely impactful. And another piece to that is your intent or your tone when you're interacting with LGBTQ students. So in my own experience with discrimination while I was in high school, in my senior year, there was a teacher who took some sort of issue with my name change and my pronouns. And it was the tone with which this teacher said my name. I knew that he was only humoring me. And so being very mindful of those pieces, we especially as trans folks, I find are very sensitive to the kind of subconscious cues you're giving. The verbal eye roll is kind of how we refer to it in my own work and in my own organization. We hear that and we see the body language, we see the way you respond to us. And so being very mindful of those internal biases that you may have, and how do you address that within yourself so that you can best serve these youth who you have signed up to serve. And I don't think it was a piece of this teacher being intentionally harmful. I genuinely believe there was discomfort with not knowing what was going on. So it's just another piece to that education. Our next question that we have is a significant tone change from our last. So what or who has been most helpful to you in becoming an empowered young person? For myself, I mentioned my person in my dedication today, my twin sister. I'm very lucky to have, who is also LGBTQ identifying. She came out before me, and when I was starting to question my gender, she was very helpful in that she would use the they them pronouns for me outside of our home where it was safe for me, but at home where I was still in the closet and I had had some hostility from my parents when I had initially come out, she continued to use she, her pronouns, which were safe for me. And she did that for a period of 6 years before I was able to finally come out to my parents again and be heard. And so my sister's advocacy for myself showed me that I'm worth advocacy and I'm worth self-advocacy. And that allowed me to take that on and take on her role for so many other young folks. And so I love this question. I love hearing what folks' answers are to this one. So Chelsea, I would love to hear who or what has empowered you.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a cliche answer, but I'd probably say my parents because they're very supportive and, they've helped me become who I am today.
It's not a cliche, and if it is, it's a cliche for a reason. Our parents are really significant to our lives. So thank you for sharing that, and I'm glad that they have you and you have them. Gray?
This is an interesting question just for me specifically because I have always been like a very outspoken and kind of a fiery person. Like I mentioned before, when I was 3 years old, I decided I was like, I don't want to dress like that. And I would that was the first argument I had with my dad, really. And I won it. Like, that's just always how I've been. I always sort of knew how I wanted to dress. And I guess I just had a sense of direction. And one of the worst things that it was a hard feeling when I started getting into middle school and being more aware of how I'm being socialized was that a lot of that self-determination was kind of being tampered down by, comments from other people, from just being socialized in the society that we live in. So I'd say, teachers who praised me. I had a 7th grade science teacher who was just like super kind to me, was always very supportive. And he was one of the most impactful people, I think, in my life, just like academically, but he was always very supportive and tried to include diversity, in the school, and was just like a very big advocate himself. So I think like myself and, and a few of my teachers, I think, who really supported that aspect of my personality, even if they didn't know about my identity or gender or sexual identity. I just think that being encouraged in that allowed me to sort of get back to that childhood sense of nonchalance I had about expressing what it is that I wanted,
Yeah, it's important that we as adults who serve youth are actively empowering you all and helping you to feel that ability, that you say nonchalance, but those abilities to speak for yourself and also brush off the things that aren't going so well. So thank you so much for sharing that. Annalie?
First, listening to the news about people being harassed and stuff influenced me to speak out against that stuff. And then my English teacher this year has helped me join 2 organizations, the Diversifier Narrative and the GSA Club.
Yeah, and the presence of these sorts of clubs on campuses is hugely influential to the success and the well-being of our LGBTQ students. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, as well as that significance of seeing LGBTQ stories, right, in the news and in media. So thank you for sharing. Shiloh?
Thank you. What's been most helpful for me is seeing and interacting with queer adults who are happy and thriving and out and proud in all facets of their life, just because I feel like the narrative we always see in media and in our day-to-day lives are teens who are struggling with their identity and with acceptance and also with just the chaos that is living life as a teenager ever. So seeing these queer adults and being like, wow, no, I can grow up and be fine and have my life figured out and be okay and be still super queer, all the time. And especially getting that support system in a way that maybe your friends and family can't, because they just don't understand that part of who you are, to the extent that someone who is also queer, is also LGBT, can understand your experiences through that lens. So that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember for myself the first time I ever met an adult using they, them pronouns in a professional environment and how that impacted my outlook on my own future. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Shiloh. Thank you. And Jax?
San Diego Pride's youth programs have been my rock throughout my gender journey and my personal activism. I spend time with them twice a week, and I'm always thrilled to be present. I consider a lot of the volunteers there to be family. Community support, whether it be through nonprofits or even through school, has absolutely made the biggest impact on me.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Jax. That sort of found family aspect is hugely influential to a lot of us in this community. And Camille, I'd love to hear from you too.
Absolutely. So the people, the people who were most influential in helping me become an empowered young adult were those staff members who noticed that I was maybe struggling with something and sat me down and asked me what was going on, and created safe spaces in that school building to listen to me. And then also those who encouraged me to find community outside of school. So showed me resources for places like San Diego Pride and the Center in San Diego, GSA Network, all of these organizations that help empower young queer youth were really influential for me. So our next question is, what might you need or want from the adults around you at school? So this can be how they can better support you, right? For me personally, I feel that sometimes when things are controversial topics, the adults in schools, especially teachers, might encourage students to host debates on these topics. So I know that when I was in school, I was asked to debate things like queer rights or trans rights or the rights of people of color in our country. And those were really actually harmful moments for me as a student growing up, because I felt it should be pressed that these rights should be a given, right? We shouldn't really have to be made to debate our space and our existence, especially not in a school environment. So if those topics should be reframed in schools is how I feel. So I'd love to hear from our panelists. Chelsea, can you go first?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the most important things teachers can do is use diverse curriculum and advocate for curriculum change. When you look at middle and high school curriculum, there's very little mention of queerness at all, which just isn't fair, right? You know, in English, we should read books about queer characters. We should read books by queer authors. And in history, we should learn about queer activism and queer people in the past. And another part of diverse curriculum is inclusive sex ed. And sex ed is currently becoming much more inclusive. Just in the time I've gone through it in middle school and high school, I've seen it grow and become more diverse, and that's amazing to watch. But one thing that's still lacking is trans inclusive sex ed. Right now, all the sex ed we're taught in school is from a very cisgender binary viewpoint, and that just needs to change.
Absolutely. Thank you for that point, Chelsea. I really appreciated that you brought up representation and the importance of that in classrooms. And also in sex ed, inclusive sex ed allows trans and queer youth to grow up to be healthy adults. So that's really important. Thank you. Annalie, can you share next?
Yes, I really appreciate when teachers ask for pronouns. It just makes me people feel safe. And then also showing their support for LGBTQ people by either putting up safe space posters or some form of like a gay flag or something like that. And then also the diverse curriculum.
Thank you for sharing that, Annalie. Yeah, something as simple as putting up a little sticker to show that your room is a safe space can be so impactful for students to see. So thank you. Gray, can you go ahead and share next?
Yeah, I love what both Annalie and Chelsea were saying. I really think that to create a space as a teacher where students feel like they can confide in you or come out to you is absolutely incredible. I know that my teacher has like a little pride flag, and as soon as I walked in, I said, you know, like at least that's there. That made me feel a little bit safer. And I also think that putting your pronouns in your Zoom name is just like a little thing you can do too if you're teaching on Zoom, right? So that way people, or at least students, know that you're like being aware of using people's proper pronouns. They might feel more comfortable asking you, or having you ask them about their pronouns. And I think really just trying to educate yourself. You know, there's really good documentaries about the trans experience, about queer experiences, reading historical queer literature, because really our history is suppressed. I mean, if you're here probably because you don't really know all that much about queer or trans people, and because it's not taught in history, it's not really spoken about in the media, and because our history is being suppressed, and a lot of us historically have been so discriminated against, we weren't really surviving, at least, or we weren't coming out and being out and proud about it. So I think that you have to do the extra work to learn about the history in order to be a better ally, and to be just generally more educated. You know, it really helps with compassion and a general understanding of sort of like the systematic layers of oppression that a lot of queer youth face.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gray, for sharing that. I think including queer histories in classes is really important, because then we feel empowered that our community has accomplished some amazing feats throughout time. And it also brings us back to the point that these identities aren't a trend, right? We've existed forever. Queer and trans people have existed forever. And so history is an amazing tool to learn that. Shiloh, can you share?
Definitely. So what I find really helpful when adults at school, and what they should be doing more, is speaking out against like rude remarks or discrimination. And like, sure, this is an LGBT panel, but also just across the board. It doesn't matter who the student is, if there are kind of like terms or phrases being used that are rude or discriminatory, like that should be stopped in a classroom no matter what, because it should be a safe space for every student. And another thing I think would be awesome is if teachers asked every single student for their name and pronouns, not just the ones who look like they might be using something that's different what's on their record. Because, you know, who knows how someone's going to be expressing. It does not have to line up with what they identify as. And it'll make someone who might have been a little worried to come out, make them just that much more comfortable, like using the name they actually want to use, the pronouns they actually want to use. And then also, like what's been mentioned earlier, it's just queer inclusive sex ed is so important.
Thank you so much, Shiloh. When teachers ask for everyone's pronouns, it makes it so much of a more emotionally and physically safer space for trans youth and queer youth, so that they can feel like they can share their pronouns without being singled out. All right, Jax.
As far as I'm aware, the adults at my school are already doing a fantastic job at supporting me and the other queer students there, which I'm so thankful for. The best thing that I believe school staff can do to help queer students is educating themselves. There are plenty of queer people, myself included, who are more than interested in sharing their knowledge and their experiences, especially via presentation, whether it be to one person or multiple people, etc. So finding and following queer accounts on social media, asking questions, just educating yourself in general is a basis for providing support. You can't support someone if you don't know the difference between what is helpful and what is harmful.
Thank you, Jax. You bring up a great point about having adults educate themselves, as well as listening to our voices and the voices of youth, right? Because sometimes when we rely too much on marginalized peoples to educate us about their experience, that's a huge mental load for us to carry. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, Evan?
Yeah, thank you. My answer also falls really close to Jax's. I was very lucky that one of the first teachers I told about my gender identity had the understanding that I didn't have all the answers. So I'm a social work student, and one of the things we talk about a lot is this idea of cultural humility and professional curiosity. And this was a teacher who referred to all of us by Mr. or Miss last name. And he looked at me one morning and he said, "Are you Mr. or Miss?" And I didn't know the answer. I was like, well, I'm not sure. but you can just call me whatever's more comfortable for you. And that wasn't a good enough answer for him. He wasn't okay with that. And so we sat down together and we searched up what language existed for non-binary individuals with that same sort of context. And for the rest of the year, I was mixed, last name MX. So that ability to say like, well, I don't know the answer. I'm also not going to expect you to know the answer. So let's find those answers together. It was something that I had never had an adult do in my youth. And it clearly has made a very lasting impact because I still remember that conversation very vividly. So our final question that we have from our pre-made list is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted you? I will speak from my professional perspective as somebody who works within the LGBTQ community. We have seen huge amounts of youth who are reporting isolation, being stuck potentially in a home with unaffirming adults. All of these different pieces can put a lot of strain on our youth, and then put a lot of strain on our youth serving LGBTQ folk as well. But then there's also a lot of resiliency that's been developed. This accessibility to virtual spaces has been huge for some of our youth, at least within my work that I've been doing. So it's been a very rapid development of virtual programs where they used to not exist at all. So huge sides to this conversation of both some isolation aspects, some negative aspects, and also some growth in connection and communication. But again, we're here to listen to you all as youth. So Chelsea, I'd like to hear from you first.
Okay, so I have kind of the weird perspective of, before the pandemic, I wasn't really involved in activism very much. And it's only this past year that I've started to join groups and get involved. So I've only really seen these activist spaces through a digital lens, and I'm excited to see what they look like in person.
Yeah, that's, the hope of being able to see these same spaces back in person and how they're going to have grown in this virtual time is huge. Thank you for bringing that up, Chelsea. Gray?
Yeah, so before the pandemic, I was only self-identified as queer. My sexuality was queer, bisexual, something along those lines. And the pandemic really gave me a lot of time to sit with myself, as we all have had, and did lead to a bit of gender crisis revelation sort of thing. So since about the summer between 2020, summer of 2020, that's when I sort of started questioning my gender, and then still am, kind of led me to here. But also pre-pandemic, I had been identifying as queer from a pretty young age, since around, I'd say, the 6th grade, since I was maybe like 12, 13. And I had I had mostly, I guess, all queer friends at that point. And one of the things that I think about a lot is that if you have a school environment that is encouraging and welcoming of queer students, they will find each other and they will make community regardless of if it's welcomed. Like, all of my friends and I started out as being like very straight, and then we all were like, oh, maybe not, right? And none of us knew. We just sort of found each other, and that's just always how it's really been. But I think if it's encouraging, if there's community with like a GSA, with advocacy groups within your school, then people can find each other more easily rather than just by coincidence, because that's not the case for all queer people. So, within the trans community and advocacy, it's something that I've also gotten into more so during the pandemic, or during this whole sort of thing. But I'm really excited to be able to interact with queer people beyond just a screen again. It really does create a sense of community, which is something that's just been so lost, I feel like, in general during the pandemic, but for a very long time. And I don't know, I miss my community. So
No, thank you, Gray. You brought up a lot of really significant points. One of the highlight is the fact that we do see a lot more of our youth who are kind of up and coming activists and outspoken young folk like yourselves. I think being in the quarantine has heightened or put a certain magnifying lens to a lot of LGBTQ issues that folks are facing. And, Annalise shared that the news has impacted her advocacy. You shared that the pandemic has impacted your own. So I think that's a really significant point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Speaking of, Annalie, would you like to share next?
Yes. Social media has also been a platform for people to share their hate for the LGBTQ community. And also me personally, I've lost some of my friends during the pandemic.
Yeah, while we see that increase of connection that comes from the virtual world, there's also the anonymity of online spaces and how that can make our youth a little bit more vulnerable. So I appreciate you bringing that up, being mindful of how our youth are accessing virtual spaces and making sure that they're safe in those spaces. Shiloh?
Yes. So before the pandemic, I was spending a lot of time with queer people outside of school. I was like spending time in queer spaces on the weekends. I was hanging out with queer friends after school, in school, and then it all stopped all at once really fast. But the flip side of that was now everything was moved online. And actually, because of that, I was spending even more time with queer people in like intentional queer spaces, but also it was online. So I still haven't figured out how I feel about that, but I'm just taking what I get because what can you do?
Yeah, the double-edged sword of the virtual connection versus the in-person, where you have a broader reach, but I miss hugging my friends. And so very much waiting for that time when I can walk back into like the San Diego Pride offices and say hello to everyone. And last but certainly not least, Jax.
So I was going to San Diego Pride in person for a few months. I'd say a few months, maybe about half a year before the pandemic hit. And the commute was a little difficult for me. So I would go as much as I could, but I would be like, I would be significantly late to a lot of programs, and I didn't get to be there as much as I wanted to. And once the pandemic hit, once we all went online, the access for me was much easier. It expanded my reach. I was able to communicate with more people, and even our programs are getting people from Fresno and beyond. So it's really interesting to get to talk with so many different people, because before I didn't really have online friends. I wasn't, communicating with people from like New York and, completely different places. And it's definitely expanded my reach, and I've learned a lot compared to even April of last year. I've really grown and learned a lot, and I don't know if I would have grown this much if it weren't for the online access that I have now.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear about some of you all who are able to connect with other LGBTQ folks, maybe in regions where they're the only person identifying similarly to themselves in that area. So the reach is, I can't get over. I'm not a very technological person, so it's been very fun to watch. And now I said last, but I meant the last of our students. And Camille, I do still want to hear from you as well, and about how the pandemic has impacted you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Evan. So for myself, the pandemic has added a bit of nervousness and hesitancy at sharing my experience in class, or my identity in classes, because with little boxes on a screen, you can't really gain an awareness of whether people are accepting of queer and trans identities or how they feel. And without those moments of walking together between classes, it's hard to facilitate conversations around that. And then I think it's really important for teachers and staff to remember that a lot of kids have been home away from the only support they get around their identities, which can be found at school. Sometimes home is not a safe environment to share those identities. So a lot of kids might have some tough transitions back to school, even though they're really excited to be in those environments again. So I want to thank everyone for sharing their stories and their personal experiences today. I'm going to pass it back to Fabiola now.
Hello, and so there was a couple of questions in the chat that I'm just going to open up to see if anyone wants to answer. We had one, let me find it. It was about what is something a teacher has done that made you feel affirmed and validated? And Gray, thank you for answering that on the chat. Is there anyone else that wants to offer something that a teacher has done? Chelsea?
Yeah, something that a teacher had done for me that was really great was just saying the word gay in class. And I distinctly remember the first time I heard the word gay in school was 6th grade, and we were reading a story about a pizza man who delivered pizza to everyone, regardless of ethnicity, race, gender. And then it said the pizza man delivers to everyone, whether they're gay or straight. And just hearing that in class made such a change for me. And at the same time, there is kind of a dark side to that, you know. I did not hear the word gay in school until 6th grade, until middle school. So yeah, I just think acknowledging that queer people exist is a really cool thing that teachers can do.
Go ahead, Jax.
I honestly really just, when I was coming out, I did not have the confidence that I have now. So I remember in some classes, I was fine with just standing up and saying, my name is Jax, these are the pronouns I'm using. In other classes, I had no confidence with that whatsoever, but I was telling myself, like, I'm just gonna knock it all out today so that everyone knows from now on. And it was really helpful for in the classes that I wasn't so confident in. My teachers, a lot of my teachers, I significantly remember my history teacher announced it for me, which was what I wanted. And I believe also in my journalism class, my teacher announced it for me or announced it with me. And that support and that just like, I'm here for you is super duper powerful.
Thank you for sharing. Gray, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing too about expression. You know, if you're not in a uniform school or something like that, it can be really spooky. Let's say somebody who's more masculine presenting wants to wear a skirt one day or do something that's sort of out of the norm for themselves. They can get a lot of, even if it's just like regular attention, it can sometimes feel like negative attention. So if you, you know, if you think that that would be good for that person to be like, oh, I like your outfit today, not even like not saying that, oh, you look different today, just more so like, I generally think that you know, I like your outfit, or I think that your makeup is cool, or just things, because a lot of that stuff is us experimenting with trying to see what makes us feel the most, what feels most authentic to ourselves, and to have some validation that, like, even if you don't like it, just be like, oh, you know, that's cool, even if they're trying something different. So, you know, if they're not getting that from peers or parents, then at least they can have that little snippet from you, because that's really helped me before.
So I know I'm here just in awe of all of you, and I've learned several things from you just within this last hour, and I know I've spent other days with you, so I'm just so blessed to actually be a part of this. And I'm thinking about all of the things that I wrote down that I wanted to make sure that I remembered. I'm going to remember the default language of cis straight and some assumptions that we make, the weight and responsibility that we should have to educate ourselves, and it should not be on you. Allowing space for growth and exploration. Junior high and high school is for identity formation. It's the perfect time to do that. The data on belonging that was shared in the beginning is very striking, because I think overall, all of us, every single human being wants to feel like they belong. The absence of action is a very strong statement. And I think all of us, as we continue to not only go from ally to accomplice, we need to make sure that there is no absence of action on our behalf, of the acknowledging of the harm, the public use of pronouns, the inclusive sex ed, the suppression of history. And I want to say the suppression of history and the celebration of the positive contributions to our country. And of course, the notion of cultural humility and professional curiosity. So thank you so much. If we were in person, you would be getting a standing ovation. So I'm hoping that the people in the audience will chat you some love and some affirmation for your time, because this was truly beautiful. Now, I know that we shared our slide deck. I'm not going to do it now because we're close to time, but that slide deck has a lot of resources for us to take a look at. You can click on them, you'll be able to see them, and they'll lead you to more resources. We also want to point you in the direction of, there are some laws that support LGBTQIA plus youth that sometimes we don't honor or don't know. And so it's really important for us to continue to educate ourselves. Again, these are all hyperlinked, you can read more about them. But lastly, and at 4 o'clock, that as parents and youth serving professionals and allies, we all have a responsibility to create safe and affirming spaces so every LGBTQ youth can be out, proud, and able to thrive. So thank you very much for joining us. I know I again, I'm so proud of being a part of this group, and thank you to all the students.